Hey friend, Callan here from Sumthins Recording, and today I'm going to show you how to mix snare drum to sound big and punchy in the mix. Let me start by playing you the snare drum inside the entire mix here, and then I'll solo it up inside the drum mix, and we'll take it one step further. I'll solo up the snare drum by itself as well. So here's our snare drum inside the entire mix. You can hear our snare drum feels really powerful inside this track. And in this back section of the song, the drums are really pushing this song through here. So we need our snare drum to be powerful, it needs to carry some weight, and it needs to have a lot of crack so it cuts through this very dense track. Let me break down what's going on our snare drum here. I'll actually A-B the processing here for you as well. It's just a limiter, a couple EQs, and a compressor. Here's without our processing, and then I'll kick it back in. You can hear the before and the after on our snare drum. You can hear using our processing, we're adding a ton of energy to our snare drum, crack-wise as well as weight-wise in the bottom end. So the first thing we're doing here, the first plugin in my chain that I like to throw in on snare drum is a limiter. I like to do a little bit of limiting to catch any stray peaks or any stray clips here on the snare drum that are kind of poking out a little bit further than everything else. So if we're looking through our snare drum here, we can see there's a couple hits. This one here at the beginning of the roll. We've got one right here that are quite a bit louder than everything else in the snare drum. I don't like to clamp down too hard on everything with a compressor. I want a more even style compression on the snare drum, so I like to use the limiter just to shave off a couple dB on some of these bigger peaks here. I've got it set at -10 here on the ceiling. I'm running it on mode A here, normal style attack, so not too fast, and then the fastest style release. I want it to get in there, grab these peaks, and then let go as fast as possible so it doesn't affect any of the other hits on the snare drum here. So just take a listen as we play through here. We're just doing a little bit of limiting on some of these bigger peaks. So you can see on that roll there, when we have that one hit that jumps out, our limiter steps in, pulls it down by about 3 dB, and makes sure it sits a little bit more snugly with the rest of the snare drum here. That's our first piece of the puzzle here. The next thing I'm doing on this snare drum is pulling in an EQ. Now don't mind these two top boosts yet, we're not going to get into those yet, but what I'm doing with these first EQ before anything else is I'm getting rid of any frequencies that I don't need or anything that's annoying on the snare drum. First piece of the puzzle here is the high pass filter on the EQ. I like to roll off a lot of the bottom end here. I don't want a lot of kick bleed in the snare drum. That way when I put in compression or any kind of low end boost, I'm boosting the body of the snare drum and not this kind of weird 200 area on the kick drum that's going to sound weird with the rest of our drum mix. So high pass filter first here, 12 dB per octave slope, rolling it up to about 138 hertz. Take a listen to how this changes our snare drum. Now it sounds like we're thinning out the snare drum a little bit, but don't worry, the positives here are outweighing the negatives of rolling up our high pass this far. We're controlling the bottom end on the snare drum here, rolling off some of that kick bleed and really cleaning up the low end frequencies on our snare drum here. It gets us a tighter sound, and don't worry, we can bring some of that bottom end back later. The next thing I like to take care of frequency-wise is getting rid of any ringing frequencies. You're always going to have some kind of frequency that's popping out on the snare drum, whether it's a ringing frequency in the room or just a tone ringing off the snare drum from the way you mic'd it. Here there was one at about 384 hertz. I just like to pull the Q up as narrow as possible and just notch that out. So I'll A-B this frequency and I'll boost it up. You can hear what I am talking about. So it's just a frequency that's ringing with the snare drum, and it's not in tune or in key with the rest of the snare drum, so I'm just pulling that out. Of course, you're going to have frequencies that are ringing in tune with the snare drum. If they sound good with the snare drum, if they're a part of the snare's natural ring, that's fine. If they get in the way of the rest of the song or the rest of the drum sound, that's something you want to take care of there. Now, we have these two top end boosts, but I don't like to do them before I get my compression in place. So I'm pulling in the stock compressor here inside of Studio One. I'm running it at about a 20 millisecond attack here, 21.9 milliseconds, and then a 76 millisecond release. So I have the attack a little bit faster than where I normally put it on drums, about 30 milliseconds. That's because you can see there's a faster and bigger transient here on the snare drum. And I don't want it to be too pokey, but I still want to leave enough room for that initial transient to pop through so we can emphasize the attack as we compress the snare drum. And then the faster release here is because I want it to let go before the next snare hit, and I want to leave enough room here so when he rolls on the snare drum that our compressor is just not holding down the snare drum there. That can sound a little bit squashed. 3-to-1 ratio, so we're not going too aggressive here on the snare drum. Take a listen to how this is changing the volume as well as the tone of our snare drum. So without it, and then with. You can hear we lose a little bit of volume because we're compressing the snare drum by about 6 dB. We're going to get that back later with our couple boosts here. Top end boosts, bottom end boosts. We're going to bring some volume and some weight back to the snare drum here. But the main thing we're getting from this compressor is, number one, it's evening out the volume on our snare drum. And number two, it's emphasizing that front end attack, that front end transient. It tames it a little bit so it's not so sharp, but it gives us this nice pop and this nice pow on our snare drum that's going to sit really well inside the rest of this track. So that's our compressor, just about 6 dB reduction there on our bigger hits. Now that we've got our compressor in place, now we're going to come back to our first EQ here, and we're going to boost top end into our compressor. I prefer to boost top end into compression. It just gives a really nice even sound to the top end, and I like to boost bottom end post-compression. I don't like pushing bottom end into compressors because then it starts to clamp down on the bottom end and you're not getting the sound you want, that nice bloom in the bottom end. Top end, on the other hand, sounds really, really good when you push it into compression. It evens out the top end and softens it in a really, really nice way. So the first frequency we're boosting here on the top end is up at 9K. This is going to give us a nice air on that crack of the snare drum, and it's going to emphasize the snare sound. So the bottom snare sound, that nice crackle and that nice crispness, that's what we're going for here. About a 5 dB boost at 9K. Really makes that roll there in the middle of the song sound really, really beautiful, giving it all that air and all that crispness there. Now the next boost I'm doing here in the top end, kind of the high mid area, is a big 6 dB boost at about 1.7K here, so almost 1.5K, almost 2K here. This is adding a ton of high mids to the snare drum. So just look visually here and we'll put this boost in. You can see there's a huge dip here in the snare drum. We have the bottom end, we have this mid-range here, now we have our top end, but there's this huge dip right here between like 1K and 5K, and that's an essential part of the snare drum. It's that nice crack, it's that nice stick attack on the snare drum, and it's going to help our snare drum cut through. So we're boosting it up quite a bit here to make sure our snare feels full and has that nice attack on it. You can hear it's about the same amount of boost as we did up at 9K, but it makes such a big difference because the mid-range is so important on snare drum. That's what makes it cut through in a track, and that's what makes it competitive here. So now, our last piece on the snare drum here, our last little bit, is just some EQ after compression. Like I said, I like to boost bottom end at the end of the chain here, and there was one more frequency that was ringing out here at about 253 hertz, so I'm just dipping that out by about 4 or 5 dB just to tame that little bit of ringing a little bit before we boost the bottom end here. You can see I'm boosting the fundamental or boosting below the fundamental on the snare drum, and there's a ringing right above the fundamental. And I'm boosting by about 3 dB, so that brings that ringing up a little bit, and we want to tame that down so it's not distracting as we add bottom end to our snare drum. I'm going to A-B both of these together here. It's about a 3 dB boost at 141 hertz. You'll see where the fundamental is, and you'll see we're boosting just below it here to bring up that lower octave and add some weight to our snare drum. So without it, and then with. Adds a ton of roundness and a ton of weight to the bottom end on our snare drum. This is another element of making the snare drum feel competitive, this time with the kick drum. So that mid-range that we add on the snare drum helps make sure it's competitive against the guitars and the vocal, and then it's going to cut through in the track. Adding some bottom end weight here helps make sure our snare drum sits with the kick drum. So if I just throw in the kick drum with the snare drum, take a listen to how this little bit of bottom end evens out our kick and snare hits. Really make sure our snare drum is a presence there inside the drum mix and then inside the mix as a whole here as well. So let's throw it back inside the entire track here and we'll A-B all of our processing. Just a few crucial steps here to make sure our snare drum is big and punchy inside our track. Doing a little bit of limiting to grab any excessive peaks on our snare drum, even it out a little bit. Using our EQ to get rid of any ringing frequencies, any excess bottom end that we don't need, some kick bleed, anything like that. Then using our compressor to even out the volume a little bit further and emphasize that initial attack. Coming back to our EQ, add that top end air, adding that mid-range crack, and finishing off with the EQ post-compression to add that bottom weight to get it big and punchy in our track. I hope that was helpful for you. If you're looking to go a little bit deeper into the mixing process and really start to dial in your workflow as an audio engineer, then I have just the tool for you, and it is completely free. It is my 7-step mixing checklist, and it's just a simple PDF that will walk you through the entire mixing process step by step to help you get professional and radio-ready mixes without any more of the hassle and without any more of the guesswork. Like I said, completely free to download. You can get access to that by clicking the link below in the video description. Thank you so much for watching here today, and I will see you in the next video.